When Milton Friedman publicly declared me his master, he revealed something profound about the intellectual foundations of free market economics. This wasn't mere academic courtesy, it was recognition of a fundamental truth about how economic knowledge develops and spreads. Friedman understood that my work on spontaneous order, the knowledge problem, and monetary theory provided the philosophical bedrock upon which his own brilliant policy insights stood. But why would such a towering intellect defer to another? The answer lies in understanding how ideas evolve, how theoretical frameworks enable practical applications, and how the most effective policies emerge from recognizing the limits of what any single mind can know. Today, I'll reveal the intellectual relationship that shaped modern economic thought and why Friedman's acknowledgement demonstrates the power of theoretical foundations in guiding practical wisdom. Chapter 1: The Theoretical Foundation That Changed Everything. My relationship with Milton began long before we met personally. It started when he encountered my theoretical work on the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism and the spontaneous coordination of market processes. While Friedman would become famous for his policy prescriptions and empirical work, he recognized that effective policy must rest on sound theoretical foundations about how economies actually function. The foundation I provided wasn't merely academic, it was epistemological. Through my analysis of the knowledge problem, I demonstrated that no central authority, however brilliant or well-intentioned, could possess the dispersed information necessary for rational economic planning. This wasn't a criticism of intelligence or good intentions, it was a recognition of the fundamental limits of human knowledge when dealing with complex social phenomena. Friedman grasped that this insight revolutionized how we should approach economic policy. If centralized knowledge is impossible, then the most effective policies are those that harness the decentralized knowledge of millions of individuals pursuing their own goals. This understanding informed everything from his advocacy for school choice to his support for flexible exchange rates. Each policy reflected the principle that decentralized decision-making typically produces superior outcomes to centralized control. My work on spontaneous order provided Friedman with a crucial insight: the market isn't just efficient at allocating resources, it's a discovery process that generates information no planner could anticipate. Prices don't just reflect existing knowledge, they create new knowledge by coordinating the actions of countless individuals, each responding to local conditions and opportunities that no central authority could possibly monitor. This theoretical framework enabled Friedman to see policy questions in an entirely new light. Rather than asking, "How can governments solve this problem?" he learned to ask, "How can we create conditions where individuals, responding to appropriate incentives, will discover solutions we cannot foresee?" This shift in perspective, from designed solutions to evolved solutions, became the hallmark of his approach to economic policy. The relationship between theory and practice that Friedman recognized in my work illustrates a broader principle about intellectual development. The most practical insights often emerge from the most abstract theoretical work, because theory helps us see patterns and principles that empirical observation alone might miss. Chapter 2: Beyond Numbers: The Philosophy of Freedom. While Friedman became renowned for his statistical prowess and empirical methodology, he understood that my contribution went beyond mere economic technique. It provided a philosophical framework for understanding why freedom works and why coercion fails. This philosophical dimension distinguished our approach from purely technocratic economics. My exploration of spontaneous order revealed that freedom isn't just morally desirable, it's epistemologically necessary. In complex social systems, no single mind can grasp all relevant information. Freedom allows this dispersed knowledge to be utilized through voluntary cooperation, while coercion necessarily relies on the inadequate knowledge of central authorities. Friedman recognized that this insight transformed debates about economic policy from questions of efficiency to questions of epistemology. The concept of spontaneous order helped Friedman understand why market solutions often work even when we can't predict exactly how they'll work. Traditional economic analysis focused on equilibrium states and optimal outcomes, but my work revealed that the process of market coordination is more important than any particular outcome. Markets don't just reach good solutions, they discover solutions that no one could have designed in advance. This process orientation revolutionized how Friedman approached policy analysis. Instead of trying to design optimal outcomes, he focused on creating institutional frameworks that would enable beneficial processes to emerge. His advocacy for negative income taxes, for example, wasn't based on knowing exactly how recipients would use the assistance, but on understanding that cash transfers preserve the incentive and information structures that enable effective adaptation. My work on cultural evolution also influenced Friedman's understanding of how beneficial institutions develop over time. Effective practices and institutions survive and spread not because someone designed them to be optimal, but because they prove superior in practice. This evolutionary perspective helped Friedman appreciate why traditional market institutions, despite their apparent complexity and inefficiency, often outperform seemingly more rational designed alternatives. The philosophical framework I provided enabled Friedman to defend free markets not just as efficient mechanisms, but as humble recognition of human knowledge limitations. This humility, the acknowledgement that we don't know enough to plan society effectively, became central to Friedman's approach to policy advocacy. He learned to argue for freedom not from arrogance about market perfection, but from modesty about human cognitive limitations. This philosophical grounding gave Friedman's policy proposals a depth and coherence that purely empirical arguments might lack. His positions weren't just supported by data, they were guided by a coherent understanding of how complex social systems actually function and how human knowledge is generated and utilized. Chapter 3: The Price System as Information Network. Perhaps nowhere was my influence on Friedman more profound than in his understanding of the price system as an information processing mechanism. While classical economics viewed prices primarily as rationing devices, my work revealed them as elements of a vast communication network that coordinates the knowledge of millions of participants. This insight revolutionized Friedman's approach to monetary theory and policy. He came to understand that when governments interfere with the price system, through controls, subsidies, or monetary manipulation, they're not just distorting resource allocation, they're disrupting the information processing that enables economic coordination. This understanding informed his passionate opposition to price controls and his advocacy for market-determined exchange rates. My analysis of how prices aggregate dispersed information helped Friedman see why market outcomes often surprise even expert observers. The price system processes information that no individual economist or policymaker possesses. When millions of people make decisions based on their local knowledge and circumstances, the resulting price movements reflect this collective wisdom in ways that no survey or study could capture. Friedman particularly appreciated my demonstration that this information processing function of prices cannot be replicated without genuine market exchange. Central planners might try to simulate market prices, but without real ownership, real scarcity, and real consequences for decisions, the informational content of prices disappears. This insight strengthened his arguments against government intervention in markets. The concept of prices as information carriers also influenced Friedman's understanding of monetary phenomena. He recognized that when central banks manipulate interest rates or money supply, they're sending false signals through the economy's information network. These false signals lead to malinvestment and economic distortions that eventually require painful corrections. This information-theoretic approach to economics enabled Friedman to understand why free markets often produce outcomes that seem impossible to achieve through conscious design. The price system coordinates the actions of people who don't know each other, have different goals, and possess different information. This coordination occurs not despite the absence of central direction, but because of it. Friedman's appreciation for the informational role of prices influenced his approach to empirical research. He understood that market outcomes reflect information that might not be captured in conventional economic data. This led him to pay particular attention to what markets were actually doing, rather than what economic models predicted they should do. The price system analysis also shaped Friedman's views on international economics. He advocated for flexible exchange rates partly because he understood that exchange rates, when freely determined, communicate crucial information about relative economic conditions across countries. Fixed exchange rate systems, however well-intentioned, disrupt this information flow and lead to accumulating imbalances that eventually force painful adjustments. This deep understanding of prices as information carriers distinguished Friedman's analysis from both Keynesian demand management and simple supply and demand mechanics, providing him with a more sophisticated framework for understanding how markets actually coordinate economic activity. Chapter 4: The Critique of Scientism in Economics. One of my most significant influences on Friedman was my critique of scientism, the misguided attempt to apply the methods of physical sciences to social phenomena without recognizing the fundamental differences between natural and social systems. This critique shaped Friedman's approach to economic methodology and his skepticism toward overly ambitious economic modeling. My analysis revealed that social sciences deal with complex phenomena where human consciousness and purposeful action create patterns fundamentally different from those found in physics or chemistry. In social systems, the objects of study, human beings, possess knowledge and form expectations that influence the very phenomena we're trying to understand. This reflexivity makes precise prediction impossible and mathematical modeling potentially misleading. Friedman absorbed this lesson and applied it to his critique of Keynesian macroeconomic models that promised precise control over economic outcomes. He understood that economies are not machines that respond predictably to policy inputs, but complex adaptive systems where human learning and adaptation constantly change the relationships economists try to model. This understanding informed his skepticism toward fine-tuning approaches to economic policy. My work on the knowledge problem helped Friedman see why econometric models often fail in practice. These models assume that relationships observed in historical data will continue into the future, but human learning means that people adapt their behavior when policies change. This Lucas critique, later formalized by Robert Lucas, reflected insights about human knowledge and adaptation that I had developed decades earlier. The critique of scientism also influenced Friedman's approach to policy advocacy. Rather than claiming scientific certainty for his policy recommendations, he emphasized that free market policies work better than alternatives in most circumstances, while acknowledging that we cannot predict all consequences of any policy change. This intellectual humility distinguished his approach from both socialist central planning and technocratic Keynesian demand management. Friedman particularly appreciated my argument that the complexity of social phenomena requires us to focus on general principles rather than detailed predictions. We can understand that market processes tend to coordinate economic activity more effectively than central planning, even though we cannot predict the specific outcomes of market processes in particular cases. This methodological insight led Friedman to emphasize the importance of institutional frameworks over specific policy outcomes. Good institutions, secure property rights, rule of law, stable money, create conditions where beneficial outcomes tend to emerge, even though we cannot design those outcomes directly. This institutional focus became central to his policy advocacy. My critique of scientism also helped Friedman understand why economic expertise has limits. Professional economists may understand general principles about how markets function, but they cannot possess the detailed local knowledge that guides individual economic decisions. This recognition led him to advocate for policies that preserve individual choice rather than substituting expert judgment for individual decision-making. The methodological framework I provided enabled Friedman to maintain scientific rigor while avoiding the scientistic pretense that economics can achieve the precision of physical sciences. Chapter 5: Monetary Theory and the Knowledge Problem. My influence on Friedman's monetary thinking represents one of the most profound applications of knowledge problem analysis to practical policy. While Friedman became famous for monetarism and his work on money supply, the theoretical foundation for his approach came from my earlier analysis of how monetary institutions evolve and why government manipulation of money creates knowledge distortions. My work on the theory of money revealed that money emerges spontaneously as a solution to the knowledge problem inherent in barter exchange. In complex economies, no individual can know the relative values of all goods and services. Money solves this problem by providing a common unit of account that enables economic calculation across diverse activities. Friedman understood that this informational role of money makes monetary stability crucial for economic coordination. The knowledge problem analysis also explained why government control of money supply creates systematic distortions. When central banks manipulate interest rates or money supply, they send false signals about the relative scarcity of resources across time. These false signals lead entrepreneurs to make investment decisions based on artificial incentives rather than real economic conditions. Friedman's advocacy for monetary rules reflected his understanding that discretionary monetary policy necessarily involves knowledge that no central authority actually possesses. My earlier work on business cycle theory demonstrated how monetary expansion creates unsustainable booms followed by inevitable corrections. The Austrian theory of the trade cycle, which I helped develop, showed that artificially low interest rates mislead entrepreneurs about the real willingness of consumers to defer consumption. This leads to overinvestment in long-term projects that cannot be sustained when monetary expansion ends. Friedman adapted these insights to develop his case for steady money supply growth. While his specific policy recommendations differed from mine, he shared my understanding that monetary manipulation creates information distortions that destabilize economic coordination. His famous declaration that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon reflected the Austrian insight that money supply growth, not specific price increases, constitutes the fundamental inflationary process. The knowledge problem also informed Friedman's critique of Keynesian monetary policy. Keynesian economics assumes that central bankers can know enough about economic conditions to fine-tune monetary policy for optimal employment and price stability. My work demonstrated that such knowledge is impossible. Economic conditions result from millions of individual decisions based on local information that no central authority can collect or process. Friedman's advocacy for monetary rules rather than discretionary policy reflected his appreciation for my broader argument about the superiority of general rules over specific commands. Rules create stable expectations that enable long-term planning, while discretionary policy creates uncertainty that hampers economic coordination. My analysis of competitive currency systems also influenced Friedman's later thinking about monetary institutions. While he initially focused on reforming government monetary policy, exposure to my work on currency competition led him to consider more fundamental questions about whether government monopoly over money is necessary or desirable. The monetary theory that emerged from this intellectual relationship emphasized institutional design over policy optimization, creating frameworks that enable market processes to coordinate monetary phenomena rather than trying to control monetary outcomes directly. Chapter 6: Constitutional Economics and the Rule of Law. Friedman's understanding of constitutional constraints on government power reflected profound influence from my work on the rule of law and constitutional economics. While his popular writings focused on specific policy issues, His deeper intellectual framework was shaped by my analysis of how legal and political institutions should be structured to preserve individual freedom and enable spontaneous order. My work on The Constitution of Liberty provided Friedman with a theoretical framework for understanding why constitutional constraints matter for economic policy. I demonstrated that effective economic policy cannot be separated from broader questions about the proper scope and limits of government power. Without constitutional restraints, even well-intentioned policies tend to expand beyond their original purposes and create precedents for further intervention. The concept of spontaneous order that influenced Friedman so profoundly extended beyond markets to legal and political institutions. I showed how common law systems, which evolved through judicial decisions responding to particular disputes, often develop more effective rules than statutory law designed by legislators trying to anticipate all possible circumstances. This evolutionary approach to institutional development provided Friedman with a framework for understanding why traditional constitutional constraints often work better than more rational-seeming alternatives. My analysis of the difference between general rules and specific commands became central to Friedman's thinking about policy design. General rules, like constitutional protections for property rights or procedural requirements for legislation, create predictable frameworks within which individuals can plan their activities. Specific commands, even when well-intentioned, necessarily rely on knowledge that government officials don't possess and create arbitrary distinctions that undermine equal treatment. Friedman particularly appreciated my argument that economic freedom and political freedom are inseparable. My analysis in The Road to Serfdom demonstrated that economic planning requires political control, because economic plans cannot be implemented without coercing individuals to act against their own judgment. This insight helped Friedman understand why preserving economic freedom requires constitutional protections that limit government's ability to intervene in economic decisions. The rule of law framework also influenced Friedman's approach to analyzing government failures. Rather than attributing policy failures to bad intentions or incompetent officials, he learned to focus on institutional incentives that systematically produce poor outcomes. Government officials responding rationally to the incentives they face will tend to expand their power and ignore long-term consequences, regardless of their personal motivations. My work on federalism and decentralization provided Friedman with additional insights about institutional design. Decentralized political systems enable policy experimentation and competition between jurisdictions, creating evolutionary pressure for effective policies. This competitive federalism serves a discovery function similar to market competition, revealing information about policy effectiveness that no central authority could generate through analysis. The constitutional economics framework helped Friedman understand why reform efforts often fail when they focus on changing policies without changing the institutional incentives that created those policies. Effective reform requires constitutional changes that alter the constraints within which political actors operate, not just different personnel or different policy preferences. Chapter 7: The Legacy of Ideas in Contemporary Policy. The intellectual relationship between Friedman and myself demonstrates how theoretical insights about spontaneous order and the knowledge problem continue to shape contemporary policy debates. Modern challenges, from cryptocurrency regulation to healthcare policy to environmental protection, still require the fundamental insights about decentralized knowledge and spontaneous coordination that influenced Friedman's approach to policy analysis. Consider how cryptocurrency demonstrates principles that both Friedman and I understood about monetary evolution. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies emerged spontaneously as solutions to problems with government-controlled money, exactly the kind of institutional innovation that my theory of spontaneous order would predict. Friedman's advocacy for competitive currencies prepared the intellectual ground for understanding why these spontaneous monetary innovations might prove superior to centrally managed alternatives. The knowledge problem analysis that influenced Friedman's thinking remains crucial for understanding contemporary regulatory challenges. When governments attempt to regulate rapidly evolving technologies like artificial intelligence or social media platforms, they face the same knowledge limitations that make central economic planning impossible. Regulatory approaches that preserve space for experimentation and adaptation typically produce better outcomes than those that attempt to predict and control technological development. Healthcare policy provides another area where the insights Friedman absorbed from my work remain relevant. Healthcare markets involve complex information problems where individual circumstances, preferences, and local conditions matter enormously. Policy approaches that preserve individual choice and enable market discovery of effective treatments tend to outperform centralized systems that attempt to optimize healthcare delivery through expert planning. Educational policy represents perhaps the clearest contemporary application of principles that shaped Friedman's thinking. School choice programs reflect understanding that no central authority can know enough about individual learning needs and teaching effectiveness to design optimal educational systems. Educational freedom enables the discovery process that reveals effective approaches while preserving parental authority over their children's education. The environmental challenges that contemporary societies face also illustrate the continued relevance of spontaneous order thinking. Market-based approaches to environmental protection, like tradable emission permits or conservation easements, harness dispersed knowledge about costs and opportunities that central planners cannot possess. These approaches enable environmental improvement while preserving the information and incentive structures that drive innovation. International economic policy continues to reflect tensions between planning and spontaneous order that Friedman understood through exposure to my work. Trade agreements that attempt to harmonize regulations across countries often suppress the institutional diversity that enables discovery of effective approaches. Free trade policies that preserve regulatory competition typically produce better outcomes than those that impose uniform standards. The financial regulation debates following the 2008 crisis illustrate how the knowledge problem analysis remains relevant. Regulatory approaches that attempt to prevent all possible risks through detailed rules necessarily rely on knowledge that regulators don't possess. Approaches that focus on general principles, like capital requirements and liability rules, preserve the market processes that generate information about actual risks. Contemporary policy challenges require the intellectual humility that characterized both Friedman's approach and my theoretical framework. Recognizing the limits of what any individual or institution can know leads to policies that preserve space for adaptation, experimentation, and discovery, the same principles that made Friedman such an effective advocate for human freedom and economic prosperity. Conclusion. Milton Friedman called me his master because he understood that effective policy advocacy requires solid theoretical foundations about how complex social systems actually function. My work provided him with insights about spontaneous order, the knowledge problem, and the limits of human reason that transformed his approach to economic analysis and policy recommendations. This intellectual relationship demonstrates the profound connection between abstract theory and practical wisdom. Friedman's most effective policy insights emerged from understanding fundamental principles about decentralized knowledge, spontaneous coordination, and the institutional requirements for human freedom. The theoretical framework I developed enabled him to see policy questions in ways that pure empirical analysis might miss. The legacy of this intellectual partnership continues to influence contemporary policy debates. Whether addressing technological innovation, environmental challenges, or financial regulation, the insights about knowledge limitations and spontaneous order that shaped Friedman's thinking remain essential for developing effective approaches to modern challenges. The humility before complex social phenomena that characterized our shared approach provides a foundation for policies that preserve human freedom while enabling beneficial social cooperation.